A shattered violin, a vanished virtuoso-nothing is what it seems. Welcome to Maigret's Casebook. I am your host, Freddy. Let me know where you're tuning in from. This mystery community is something special. Your comments always brighten my day. Let's uncover the truth. The rain hammered against the narrow cobblestone streets of Montmartre, a relentless grey curtain that seemed to wash the color from the world. In the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, the small antique shop on Rue des Martyrs stood like a forgotten relic, its warped wooden sign creaking in the wind. Inside, a single light burned in the back room, casting jagged shadows over shelves of dusty curiosities, porcelain dolls with cracked faces, tarnished silverware, and violins hanging like silent ghosts on the walls. It was nearing midnight on that cold November evening in 1932 when Monsieur Etienne Dubois, the shop's reclusive owner, was found dead, slumped over his cluttered workbench with a shattered violin clutched in his rigid hands. The scene was as perplexing as it was grim. The shop's front door had been locked from the inside, the ancient bolt rusted in place, and the tiny, grime-streaked window at the back showed no signs of tampering. Yet there was Dubois, his grey hair matted with blood from a single, precise, wound to the temple, inflicted by a blunt instrument that was nowhere to be found. The broken violin in his grasp seemed an odd detail, its neck snapped clean in two, strings curling like lifeless tendrils, shards of its polished wood littered the floor, mingling with the dust and debris of a shop that hadn't seen a proper cleaning in years. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like a simple robbery gone wrong. But there was no sign of forced entry, nothing visibly stolen, and most curiously no footprints in the thick layer of dust save for Dubois' own, leading from the front counter to his workbench. Word of the peculiar crime reached Inspector Jules Maigret shortly after dawn. As he sat in his cramped office at the Quai des Orfèvres, nursing a cup of bitter coffee and staring out at the Seine through a fogged window, Maigret was not a man of theatrics. His broad frame, pipe clenched between his teeth, and heavy-lidded eyes gave him the air of a weary laborer rather than a detective of renown. Yet his mind was a steel trap, honed by years of unraveling the tangled knots of human malice. When Sergeant Lucas burst in with the report, stammering about a locked room murder in Montmartre, Maigret's interest peaked. He didn't believe in impossible crimes, only in puzzles that hadn't yet revealed their edges. By the time Maigret arrived at the antique shop, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the air still hung heavy with dampness. The local gendarmes had cordoned off the area, their boots tracking mud across the already grimy floor as they milled about, muttering theories that ranged from plausible to absurd. A young officer with a nervous tic handed Maigret the initial report, pointing out the obvious: no entry, no exit, no weapon, no suspect. Maigret barely glanced at the paper. Instead, he knelt beside Dubois' body, his thick fingers brushing over the jagged edges of the broken violin. The instrument was old, its varnish worn to a dull sheen, but there was something deliberate in the way it had been destroyed, as if the act carried a weight beyond mere violence. Curious, Maigret muttered to himself, his voice a low growl. He straightened up, his gaze sweeping the room. The shelves were crowded with trinkets, but nothing seemed disturbed. A half-empty bottle of cheap wine sat on the counter, alongside a crust of bread and a smeared glass Du Bois last meal. Perhaps. Behind the workbench, a narrow staircase led to a loft above, likely the old man's living quarters. Maigret climbed it slowly, his heavy steps echoing in the stillness. The loft was sparse a sagging cot, a chipped basin, and a single trunk pushed against the wall. Inside the trunk, beneath a pile of moth-eaten clothes, he found a small tin box filled with letters, yellowed and tied with twine. The handwriting on the topmost envelope was elegant, feminine, and addressed to my dearest Etienne. A lover, perhaps, or a secret long buried. Descending back to the shop, Maigret's attention returned to the violin. He crouched again, peering at the fragments. One piece, near the body, bore a faint carving on its inner surface, a tiny, crudely etched symbol resembling a crescent moon. It seemed out of place on such a delicate instrument, almost as if it had been scratched there intentionally. A clue, a red herring? Maigret couldn't say, but it gnawed at him, a loose thread in an otherwise impenetrable tangle. He instructed Lucas to bag the violin pieces for closer examination, and ordered a canvass of the neighborhood. Someone must have seen or heard something. Even in the dead of a rainy night, the initial interviews yielded little. The shopkeeper, next door, a weary man with a perpetual scowl, claimed Du Bois kept to himself, rarely speaking to anyone beyond curt pleasantries. He was odd, the man grumbled, wiping his hands on a stained apron, always muttering about the past, about debts unpaid. I heard shouting from his shop sometimes, late at night, but I never saw anyone go in or out. A flower seller across the street mentioned a shadowy figure lurking near the shop 2 nights prior, but her description was vague. A tall man, or perhaps a woman, bundled in a dark coat. Maigret jotted it down, though he knew such accounts were often more imagination than fact. As the day wore on, the mystery deepened. The coroner confirmed that Du Bois had died around midnight, killed by a single blow with a heavy, rounded object, possibly a hammer or a candlestick, though no such item was found. The dust on the floor remained undisturbed except for Du Bois' footprints, ruling out an intruder unless they possessed the ability to float. Maigret paced the shop, his pipe sending plumes of smoke into the musty air, his mind turning over the pieces: a locked room, a broken violin, a dead man with secrets tucked away in a tin box. It was either the simplest of crimes, dressed up to look complex, or a labyrinth so intricate that its heart might never be reached. He stepped outside. For a moment, the drizzle cooling his face as he stared at the shop's facade. The answer, he knew, lay not in the impossible, but in the overlooked. The violin, why had it been broken? Why clutched so tightly in death? And that crescent mark, what did it mean? Maigret felt the weight of the case settle on his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a challenge. He would sit with it, as he always did, letting the fragments simmer in his mind until they formed a picture. For now, though, the rain fell, the streets of Montmartre whispered their secrets, and the mystery of the broken violin remained stubbornly opaque. Maigret lingered outside the antique shop. On Rue des Martyrs, the drizzle clinging to his overcoat as he chewed thoughtfully on the stem of his pipe. The muted chatter of the gendarmes and the distant clatter of a passing cart faded into the background as his mind churned over the Loctroon conundrum, the broken violin, the crescent mark scratched into its wood, the undisturbed dust it, all pointed to a crime that defied logic, yet Maigret knew better than to chase phantoms. Crimes were human, and humans left traces, even if they thought they'd covered their tracks. He turned back to the shop's entrance, his heavy boots crunching on the wet cobblestone, determined to see what others had missed. Inside, the air remained thick with the scent of dust and old varnish, the scene unchanged save for the coroner's team carefully lifting Dubois' body onto a stretcher. Maigret waved them off with a grunt, his attention drawn to the workbench where the old man had spent his final moments. The gendarmes had already combed the area for fingerprints and catalogued the meager contents tools, scraps of wood, a tarnished brass lamp, but their efforts were perfunctory, focused on the obvious. Maigret, however, knelt again, his knees creaking as he examined the floor beneath the bench. Amid the debris of violin shards and sawdust, something caught his eye, a tiny, glistening speck that didn't belong. He plucked it up between his thick fingers, holding it to the dim light. A fragment of glass, no larger than a thumbnail, its edges jagged and tinged with a faint amber hue. It wasn't from the wine bottle on the counter. That glass was thicker, cheaper. This was finer, almost delicate. Maigret's brow furrowed as he slipped the fragment into a small envelope, his mind already racing. Had something else been shattered alongside the violin, or had this been brought in from outside? Carried unwittingly by the killer, he stood, scanning the room with renewed intensity. The shelves groaned under their weight of forgotten treasures, but nothing immediately suggested a source for the glass. His gaze drifted to the brass lamp on the workbench. It was unlit, its wick blackened, but something about its base seemed off. He lifted it, tilting it gently, and noticed a hairline crack along the edge of its glass chimney, a crack that hadn't been there when he'd first glanced at it, or so he thought. A closer look revealed a missing sliver, its shape a near match for the fragment in his envelope. Someone had struck the lamp, perhaps in a struggle, and the piece had fallen unnoticed. But struck with what, and why? The discovery deepened the puzzle, but Maigret kept his thoughts to himself as he turned his attention to the gendarmes' reports. Sergeant Lucas approached, his notebook in hand, rattling off the latest findings from the neighborhood canvass. Most of it was predictable. Dubois had been a loner, distrusted by some, pitied by others. But one detail stood out. A baker's apprentice, a boy of barely 16, claimed to have heard a muffled cry from the direction of the shop just past midnight, followed by a sharp, cracking sound. The boy hadn't thought much of it at the time, chalking it up to the storm, but now, in hindsight, he seemed rattled, his freckled face pale as he recounted the story to Lucas. Maigret listened intently, watching the boy through the shop's open door as he stood huddled under an awning with a gendarme. The lad's hands fidgeted, twisting a torn scrap of his apron, and his eyes darted nervously, avoiding direct contact. Fear, perhaps, or something more. Bring him in. Maigret said quietly to Lucas, his tone leaving no room for argument. The sergeant nodded and fetched the boy, whose name was Pierre, up close. Pierre's unease was palpable, his thin shoulders hunched as if bracing for a blow, and a faint sheen of sweat glistened on his brow despite the chill. Maigret didn't interrogate him immediately. Instead, he offered a reassuring nod, pulling a chair from behind the counter and gesturing for the boy to sit. "You're not in trouble, lad," he said, his voice low and steady, like a father confiding in a son. "Just tell me what you heard. Every detail, no matter how small." Pierre swallowed hard, his fingers still worrying the apron scrap. I was closing up, Inspector. The bakery. It's just down the street. I heard the cry, like someone was in pain. But it was quick, cut off. Then there was this sound, like wood snapping, or maybe glass. I thought it was thunder. At first, with the storm and all, I didn't see anything. I swear. I went home after that." His voice trembled on the last words, and his gaze dropped to the floor, as if hiding something behind those lowered lids. Maigret leaned back, lighting his pipe with a slow, deliberate motion, the puff of smoke curling around him like a veil. He studied Pierre, noting the boy's flushed cheeks, the way his left hand twitched as if longing to fit it again. "You didn't think to check, then?" Maigret asked, his tone neutral but probing. "A cry like that, in the middle of the night, it must have unnerved you." Pierre shook his head too quickly, a jerky motion. I was tired, sir, and scared. I didn't want trouble. My master, he'd have my hide if I was late locking up." The excuse was plausible, but Maigret sensed a lie beneath it, a crack in the boy's story as subtle as the one in the lamp's chimney. He didn't press further, though, not yet. Instead, he thanked Pierre and dismissed him, making a mental note to have Lucas tail the boy discreetly. If Pierre knew more, he'd slip up eventually. Nervous types always did. Alone again in the shop, Maigret returned to the workbench, the fragment of glass and the cracked lamp still nagging at him. He ran his fingers over the lamp's base, feeling the weight of it, heavy enough to deliver a fatal blow, perhaps, if swung with force, but the coroner had mentioned a rounded object, and the lamp's edges were too angular. Still, it tied into the narrative somehow. A struggle, a lamp struck or knocked over, glass breaking alongside the violin. But how had the killer entered and exited without a trace? And why the violin? Why destroy something so seemingly insignificant? His thoughts drifted to the letters he'd found in the loft, tucked away in that tin box. He retrieved them from his coat pocket, settling onto the creaky chair Pierre had vacated. The elegant handwriting on the envelope stirred a flicker of intrigue. He opened the topmost letter, dated nearly 20 years prior, and scanned the contents. It was a love letter, passionate and pleading, signed only with the initial M. Phrases leaped out, promises of reunion, hints of a shared secret, regret over what we lost. Maigret frowned, folding the letter back into its envelope. A past romance could mean motive, jealousy, betrayal, unresolved debts of the heart. But 20 years was a long time for a grudge to fester. unless something had recently reignited old flames. The rain had stopped, leaving a damp silence in its wake, but the weight of the case pressed heavier on Maigret. The glass fragment, the boy's shaky demeanor, the letters they were pieces of a mosaic, scattered and incomplete. He sensed deception, not just in Pierre's trembling words, but in the very air of the shop, as if the walls themselves held their breath, guarding the truth. For now, he'd keep watching, listening, letting the unspoken betray itself. The secret of the broken violin was still out of reach, but Maigret knew he was closing in. One overlooked detail at a time, Maigret sat hunched over the cluttered workbench. In the antique shop, the faint smell of tobacco clinging to his overcoat as he reread the love letter signed M. The words echoed with a melancholy that felt personal, almost raw, hinting at a history Du Bois had kept buried outside. The late afternoon light filtered through the grimy window, casting long shadows across the dusty floor where the old man's body had lain just hours ago, the fragment of glass from the cracked lamp, now tucked safely in an envelope in his pocket, and the nervous demeanor of young Pierre weighed on Maigret's mind. He knew the truth often hid in the cracks of what people said and what they didn't. It was time to listen to the voices around Rue des Martyrs, to sift through their stories for the lies that would lead him closer to the secret of the broken violin. He started with the neighbors, summoning them one by one to the shop under the guise of routine questioning. The first to arrive was Madame Claret, the flower seller from across the street, her weathered hands still dusted with soil. From her morning's work, she bustled in, her shawl slipping from her shoulders, and launched into her account before Maigret could even ask a question. "I saw someone, Inspector. I swear it," she declared, her voice sharp with the thrill of gossip. "2 nights ago, near the shop, a tall figure, all in black, skulking about like a thief. Couldn't see their face, mind you, with the rain and the dark, but they were up to no good. I'll wager. Poor Monsieur Du Bois. I always said he'd come to a bad end, keeping such strange hours." Maigret nodded, his expression unreadable as he puffed on his pipe. Her eagerness to share was telling to polished, almost rehearsed. "And last night?" he asked, his tone mild. "Around midnight, when the storm was at its worst, did you see or hear anything then?" Madame Claret hesitated, just a fraction of a second, before shaking her head. "No, Inspector. I was abed by then. The wind was howling something fierce. It would have drowned out anything short of a gunshot." Her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her shawl, and Maigret noted the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Was she hiding something, or merely unsure of her own memory? He thanked her, jotting a note to revisit her story later, sensing that her zeal to help masked a deeper reluctance. Next came Monsieur Gerard, the surly shopkeeper from next door, who entered with a scowl, wiping his hands on his stained apron as if the interruption were a personal affront. "I've told your men already," he grumbled, crossing his arms. Du Bois was a hermit, muttering to himself like a madman half the time. "Didn't bother me none, so long as he paid his share of the alley cleanup. Last night, didn't see or hear a thing. Storm kept me up, rattling the shutters. But that's all. If someone bashed his head in, Good riddance, less nonsense to deal with. Maigret raised an eyebrow at the man's callousness, but his focus snagged on a small contradiction. Earlier, Gerard had mentioned hearing shouting from Dubois' shop on occasion, late at night. Now he claimed to have heard nothing during the storm. "You're sure?" Maigret pressed, his voice steady but pointed. "A man dies next door, and you didn't notice even a scuffle. Your walls can't be that thick." Gerard's jaw tightened, a flush creeping up his neck. "I sleep heavy, all right, and with the rain. I wouldn't have heard a parade marching through. That's all I've got to say." He turned to leave, but Maigret's gaze lingered on the man's retreating back. Noting the stiffness in his posture, Gerard was holding something back, perhaps out of spite or fear of entanglement. The question was whether it mattered to the case, or was merely petty resentment. As Gerard left, Maigret signaled to Lucas to bring in Pierre again, the baker's apprentice whose earlier nerves had piqued his suspicion. The boy shuffled in, looking smaller than before, his eyes darting to the spot where Dubois' body had been found. Maigret offered him a reassuring nod, gesturing to the chair. "I've been thinking about what you said, Pierre," he began, his tone conversational. "A cry and a cracking sound in the night. It must have stuck with you. Tell me again exactly what you remember. Don't leave anything out." Pierre licked his lips, his hands twisting in his lap. "It's like I said, sir. I was locking up the bakery around midnight. Heard a shout, quick and sharp, like someone got hurt. Then that noise like something breaking. I thought it was the storm, maybe a branch snapping. I didn't think to check. I just went home." His voice wavered, and he shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Maigret's steady gaze. Over the next hour, Maigret spoke with others, a street sweeper who claimed Dubois owed money to half the neighborhood, a widow who insisted she'd seen the old man arguing with a well-dressed stranger weeks ago, and a drunk who mumbled incoherently about ghosts in the shop. Their stories varied, some overlapping, others diverging sharply, but each carried a thread of inconsistency. The street sweeper's timeline of Dubois' debts didn't match Gerard's claim of indifference. The widow's description of the stranger was vague, almost theatrical, as if embellished for effect. And through it all, Maigret sensed hidden motives, grudges, fears, perhaps even guilt-like undercurrents beneath their words. As evening fell, casting the shop in a muted grey, Maigret stood by the window, his pipe relit, smoke curling lazily upward. The voices of deception surrounded him, each witness painting a fractured picture of the night Dubois died. Madame Claret's over-eagerness, Gerard's defensiveness, Pierre's trembling evasions, they all hinted at secrets, personal stakes that might or might not connect to the murder. And then there were the letters from him, a ghost from Dubois' past whose shadow loomed over the case. Maigret felt the puzzle tightening, the pieces shifting closer together. Though the full shape remained elusive, he turned back to the workbench, his fingers brushing over the spot where the broken violin had lain, the crescent mark etched into its wood, the fragment of glass from the lamp. The conflicting stories, they were threads in a tapestry of lies. Someone on Rue des Martyrs knew more than they admitted, and Maigret was determined to unravel their silence. The night was still young, and the truth, he knew, often whispered loudest in the dark. The twilight deepened over Rue des Martyrs, the narrow street now cloaked in a damp chill as Maigret stood by the grimy window of the antique shop, the ember of his pipe glowing faintly in the dimness. The voices of the witnesses, Madame Clairet's eager gossip, Gerard's gruff denials, Pierre's trembling half-truths echoed in his mind, each layered with hints of hidden agendas. The broken violin, the crescent mark, the fragment of glass, and the love letters signed M all pointed to a crime rooted in something deeper than a mere robbery gone wrong. Maigret knew that motives were the bones of any murder case, often buried beneath layers of pretense and lies. As the night settled in, he resolved to dig into the tangled maze of reasons why someone would want Etienne Dubois dead, sifting through the suspects' lives for the thread that would tie the puzzle together. He began by revisiting the letters found in Dubois' loft, spreading them out on the cluttered workbench under the flickering light of the brass lamp. The elegant handwriting of M spoke of a passionate, painful past love affair marked by longing and loss. The most recent letter, dated just 3 months prior, carried a sharper tone, mentioning a debt unpaid and a need to settle accounts before it's too late. The words hinted at more than emotional baggage. They suggested a financial or moral obligation, perhaps one Dubois had dodged for years. Maigret rubbed his chin, considering the possibility of a scorned lover or a betrayed partner seeking retribution. But who was M? A woman, likely, given the handwriting and tone, though not necessarily. Identifying her or him would be key. But for now, the letters opened a door to revenge as a motive, a simmering grudge reignited by some recent trigger, turning his attention to the neighbors. Maigret sent Lucas to dig into their backgrounds, while he mulled over their alibis and potential reasons for malice. Madame Clairet, the flower seller, had been quick to point fingers at a shadowy figure, but her own story held gaps. Lucas returned within the hour with word that Clairet's late husband had once been in business with Dubois, a partnership that ended badly over disputed profits some 15 years ago. Rumor had it Clairet still harbored bitterness, blaming Dubois for her husband's financial ruin and eventual death from drink, greed, then, or a desire for belated justice could she have seen an opportunity to settle an old score? Her alibi of being asleep during the storm was flimsy, unverified by anyone, and her overly cooperative demeanor might mask a calculated diversion. Maigret noted her as a person of interest, though her physical strength to deliver a fatal blow seemed questionable. Monsieur Gerard, the shopkeeper next door, presented a different angle. His hostility toward Dubois was palpable, and Lucas uncovered whispers of a recent dispute over property lines. Dubois had allegedly encroached on Gerard's storage space behind their shops, leading to heated arguments. Gerard's claim of sleeping through the storm contradicted his earlier admission of hearing shouts on other nights, suggesting he was either lying or selectively forgetful. His temper, coupled with proximity to the crime scene, painted a picture of opportunity fueled by petty revenge. Yet, Maigret wondered if a mere boundary spat warranted murder. Gerard's gruffness could be a shield for something deeper, perhaps. Fear of suspicion or involvement in something unrelated but incriminating. His alibi, too, rested on his word alone, a weak foundation under scrutiny. Pierre, the baker's apprentice, remained the most enigmatic. The boy's nervous tics and evasive answers hinted at knowledge he wasn't sharing. Lucas, discreet, shadowing earlier in the evening, revealed little beyond Pierre's hurried return to the bakery and a tense exchange with his master, a burly man known for a quick temper. Maigret suspected Pierre might have witnessed something or someone he feared implicating, possibly under threat from his employer or another figure. Fear as a motive for silence was plausible, but could it extend to complicity in murder? The boy lacked an obvious reason to harm Dubois, yet his proximity to the shop and the timing of the cry he admitted hearing placed him uncomfortably close to the act. Maigret decided to lean on the bakery master next, sensing Pierre's silence might crack under pressure from a different angle. Beyond the immediate suspects, Maigret considered broader connections. The street sweeper's claim of Dubois owing money to half the neighborhood suggested financial motives, creditors tired of waiting, perhaps resorting to violence. Lucas tracked down a local loan shark known to operate in Montmartre, a man named Victor Leclerc, whose name surfaced in connection with Dubois' debts. Leclerc denied involvement, offering a slick alibi of being at a card game across town. Supported by two associates whose reputations were as dubious as his own, greed could drive a man like Leclerc to murder over unpaid loans, and his polished denial felt to practiced. Maigret marked him for further investigation, suspecting hired muscle might explain the precision of the fatal blow and the absence of traces in the locked room. As the night wore on, Maigret pieced together a web of deception, each suspect tied to Dubois by threads of resentment, debt, or fear. Clarette's old grudge over her husband's ruin, Gerard's territorial spat, Pierre's unspoken terror, Leclerc's predatory interest, they all had reasons to wish Dubois harm. Yet no single theory accounted for everything. The locked room remained a stubborn enigma. None of the suspects seemed capable of entering and exiting without leaving a mark, unless Maigret was overlooking a hidden access point or a clever ruse. The broken violin, too, nagged at him. Why destroy it, unless its destruction held symbolic weight, tied to a personal vendetta like the one hinted at in M's letters? Sitting back in the creaky chair, Maigret relit his pipe, the smoke curling around him like the tangled motives he was unraveling. He began sketching connections in his notebook. Clarette to past betrayal, Gerard to recent animosity, Pierre to potential coercion, Leclerc to ruthless gain. Each alibi was thin, easily punctured with the right pressure, but the full picture eluded him. Jealousy, revenge, greed, fear, they interwove in a maze where every path seemed to lead to Dubois' death. Yet none offered a clear exit. The crescent mark on the violin fragment, a detail still unexplained, felt like a signpost he hadn't yet deciphered, possibly linked to M or another buried secret. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, echoing the hour of Dubois' murder just a day prior. Maigret felt the weight of time pressing him forward, knowing that motives, however tangled, would clarify with persistence. He instructed Lucas to keep tabs on Leclerc's movements and to dig deeper into the identity of M, possibly through old records or mutual acquaintances of Du Bois. The web of deception was tightening. Each contradiction and half-truth are not to be untied. The inspector's gaze drifted to the spot where the violin had shattered, sensing that the answer lay not just in why Du Bois died, but in what he clung to in his final moment. The maze of motives was vast, but Maigret was patient. He would navigate its twists until the truth stood bare. The dim glow of the brass lamp cast flickering shadows across the antique shop as Maigret sat at the workbench, his notebook filled with scribbled connections between suspects and motives. The midnight hour had passed, and the stillness of Rue des Martyrs outside mirrored the quiet intensity of his thoughts. The maze of greed, revenge, and fear surrounding Etienne Du Bois' murder had grown denser with each witness interrogated, each alibi dissected. Yet the broken violin with its cryptic crescent mark and the love letters signed M remained elusive keys to the locked room mystery. Maigret puffed on his pipe, the smoke curling like the unanswered questions in his mind when the door creaked open and Sergeant Lucas burst in, his face alight with urgency. "Inspector, we've got something," Lucas exclaimed, holding out a small, crumpled piece of paper. "Found this tucked behind a loose brick in the alley behind the shop. One of the gendarmes spotted it while retracing Du Bois' last known movements. Look at this, it's a receipt, dated 2 days ago, for a heavy brass candlestick, purchased by none other than Monsieur Gerard, the shopkeeper next door. And there's more smudged ink on the back. Looks like a scrawled apology or threat. Hard to make out, but it mentions paying for old sins." Maigret took the receipt, his heavy fingers smoothing it out under the lamp's light. The item description matched a potential murder weapon, a blunt, rounded object. As the coroner had suggested, Gerard's name on the receipt was a damning link, and the scribbled note, though illegible in parts, carried a tone of resentment that aligned with the shopkeeper's hostility toward Du Bois. Maigret's mind raced back to Gerard's defensiveness, his weak alibi of sleeping through the storm, and the rumors of their property dispute. Could this be the breakthrough they needed? A candlestick, wielded in anger over a petty grudge, might explain the precise blow to Du Bois' temple, and Gerard's proximity to the crime scene made him a plausible culprit. "Bring Gerard in now," Maigret ordered, his voice steady but edged with anticipation. "And check his shop for that candlestick. If it's missing or shows signs of use, we've got a strong case. But keep it quiet, I don't want the neighborhood buzzing just yet." Lucas nodded, hurrying out into the night, while Maigret leaned back, staring at the receipt. The evidence seemed to point directly at Gerard, a neat solution to a tangled puzzle. Yet something gnawed at him, a quiet unease beneath the apparent clarity. The locked room still defied explanation. How had Gerard, or anyone, entered and exited without disturbing the dust or the rusted bolt? Within the hour, Gerard was dragged back to the shop, his scowl deeper than ever, his arms crossed defiantly as he stood before Maigret. Lucas reported that the candlestick was indeed missing from Gerard's inventory, though a matching base had been found in his back storeroom, polished as if recently cleaned. I don't know what you're on about, Gerard snapped, his voice rough with irritation. I bought that candlestick for a customer. Delivered it day before yesterday. Got nothing to do with Dubois or whatever happened to him. You've got no proof I was even in here. Maigret held up the receipt, his gaze unyielding. This says otherwise, Monsieur Gerard. And the note on the back, paying for old sins, sounds personal. You've had words with Dubois over that property line, haven't you? Neighbors heard your shouting matches. A candlestick goes missing from your shop, and a man ends up dead next door, with a wound matching a blunt, heavy object. Care to explain? Gerard's flush deepened, his jaw working as if chewing on a retort. But he faltered under Maigret's steady stare. I didn't write no note, he mumbled, less certain now. And I told you, I slept through the storm. Someone must have nicked that candlestick or planted that paper to frame me. I've got enemies. Inspector, same as Dubois, check with Leclerc. That loan shark. He's had it out for me since I missed a payment last month. Maigret noted the deflection, but pressed no further for the moment. Gerard's denial was shaky, and the missing candlestick, combined with the receipt, was enough for the higher-ups at the Quai des Orfèvres to push for an arrest. By morning, word had spread through the gendarmerie and the local magistrate, eager for a quick resolution to appease the anxious neighborhood, declared the case all but solved. A classic crime of passion over a feud. The magistrate proclaimed to a small gathering of officers outside the shop, his voice carrying a tone of finality. Gerard had motive, means, and opportunity. Will hold him pending a formal confession or further evidence. Good work, men. The gendarmes nodded, some exchanging relieved glances, ready to close the file on the baffling Loctroom murder. Newspapers were already printing early editions, sensationalizing the arrest, with headlines of Montmartre murderer caught. Maigret, however, stood apart near the shop's entrance, his pipe cold in his hand, his expression unreadable. The receipt and missing candlestick painted a compelling picture, but the unease in his gut refused to settle. Gerard's guilt seemed too convenient, the evidence almost too perfectly placed, and the locked room still no explanation for how the killer had managed the impossible. Maigret's instinct, honed over years of peeling back layers of deception, whispered that the real criminal was watching from the shadows. Banking on this false victory to divert attention, he revisited the crime scene alone as the morning drizzle resumed, pacing the dusty floor where Dubois had fallen. The broken violin fragments, now bagged and stored at headquarters, lingered in his mind. Why destroy it unless it held a significance beyond mere collateral damage? The crescent mark, the letters from M, the untouched dust, none of these fit neatly into Gerard's narrative of a spontaneous, rage-fueled attack. Maigret crouched by the workbench, his eyes scanning for anything overlooked in the rush to pin the crime on Gerard. Near the base of the bench, almost hidden by a pile of wood shavings, he spotted a faint scuff mark in the dust, not a footprint, but a drag, as if something small had been moved. It led toward the narrow staircase to the loft, a detail missed. In the initial sweep, his pulse quickened slightly, though his face remained impassive. He followed the mark upstairs, finding nothing immediately obvious in the sparse loft. But the discovery reinforced his doubt. Someone had been meticulous, covering their tracks with care, and Gerard, for all his temper, didn't strike Maigret as that calculating. The real killer, he suspected, had orchestrated this arrest as a distraction, perhaps planting the receipt. To shift blame, was it the clerk, the loan shark, with his slick alibi and predatory reach, or him, the ghostly figure from Du Bois' past, whose letters hinted at a deeper vendetta? Even young Pierre's fear or Madame Clarette's bitterness couldn't be dismissed. Maigret straightened, gazing out the loft's tiny window at the grey dawn over Montmartre. The authorities might celebrate their early triumph, but he knew the case was far from closed. The true culprit waited, hidden behind this smoke-screen of false evidence, possibly poised to strike again if threatened. Maigret tucked the thought away, his resolve hardening. He would play along with the official narrative for now, letting the killer believe their ruse had succeeded, while he worked in the background, watching, waiting for the inevitable slip. The secret of the broken violin remained unsolved, and Maigret was determined to uncover it before the shadows struck again. The grey dawn hung heavy over Montmartre. As Maigret stood by the tiny window in Du Bois' loft, the faint drizzle pattering against the warped glass below on Rue des Martyrs, the murmur of early risers and the clatter of carts signaled the world moving on. While inside the antique shop, the air remained thick with unanswered questions. The arrest of Gerard, bolstered by the damning receipt and missing candlestick, had satisfied the magistrate and the gendarmes. But Maigret's unease persisted, a quiet itch beneath the surface of the supposed victory. The scuff mark in the dust near the workbench, the Loctrum enigma. The broken violin with its crescent mark, these fragments refused to align with the neat narrative of a neighborly feud turned deadly as he descended the narrow staircase. His heavy boots creaking on the worn steps, Maigret resolved to dig deeper, beyond the present, into the shadows of Du Bois' past, where the true roots of this crime might lie. Back at the workbench, Maigret retrieved the stack of letters signed him from his coat pocket, their yellowed edges worn from years of hiding in the tin box. He'd read them before, noting the passion and pain woven through the words, as well as the more recent hint of a debt unpaid. Now, with Gerard's arrest failing to quiet his doubts, he examined them with renewed focus under the flickering light of the brass lamp. One letter, dated nearly 20 years ago, caught his attention, a fleeting reference to the night at La Lune Crescenti, a phrase that struck a chord. La Lune Crescenti, the crescent moon, matched the symbol etched into the broken violin fragment. It couldn't be coincidence. The mark wasn't random. It was a signature, a memory, a link to an event or place Du Bois and M shared. Maigret's pulse quickened slightly, though his face remained impassive. As he tucked the letters away, determined to uncover what La Lune Crescenti meant, he summoned Lucas with a curt note to meet him at the Quai des Orfèvres, where the police archives might hold clues to old cases or establishments tied to that name. Meanwhile, he revisited the violin fragments, stored in evidence bags at the local precinct nearby. Examining the crescent mark again under a harsher light, he confirmed its deliberate nature, crudely carved, yes, but intentional, as if branding the instrument with a reminder of something lost or betrayed. The violin, Maigret suspected, wasn't just a casualty of the murder. It was central to the motive, tied to whatever transpired at La Lune Crescenti all those years ago. By mid-morning, Maigret sat in the dusty archive room at headquarters, a stack of faded files before him as Lucas flipped through yellowed newspapers nearby. The name La Lune Crescenti surfaced in a 1912 incident report, a small cabaret in Montmartre, notorious for late-night brawls and shady dealings, had been the scene of a violent robbery. 2 men had been arrested, one of them Etienne Dubois, then a young violinist playing for tips in such venues. The report detailed how Dubois and an accomplice, identified only as Marcel, had been implicated in a theft of cash and jewelry from the cabaret's owner during a chaotic fight. Dubois had been released for lack of evidence, while Marcel served a short sentence. The cabaret's emblem, described in passing, was a crescent moon, a symbol of luck turned sour by the night's events. Maigret leaned back, his pipe unlit between his lips, as the pieces shifted in his mind. Dubois' past wasn't just a backdrop, it was a shadow over the present murder. The crescent mark on the violin could be a reminder of that night, etched by someone who knew of Dubois' history at La Lune Crescenti, perhaps whose letters bore the weight of shared secrets. Had Marcel returned, nursing a grudge over Dubois escaping punishment while he bore the brunt? Or was M tied to the cabaret's owner, seeking retribution for a theft never fully repaid? The debt unpaid in the letter now carried a literal edge, possibly financial, intertwined with emotional scars. Lucas, meanwhile, unearthed a grainy photograph from a 1912 newspaper, a snapshot of La Lune Crescenti's performers, including a young Dubois holding a violin. Beside him stood a woman, her face half-turned, labeled only as Madeleine. Singer, the initial M fit, and her proximity to Dubois in the photo suggested intimacy. Matching the tone of the letters, Maigret squinted at the image, noting her sharp cheekbones and dark eyes, wondering if she still lived in Montmartre, hiding behind a new name or life. If Madeleine was M, her connection to Dubois, and possibly to the robbery, could explain the personal vendetta hinted at in her words. The past was weaving into the present. But another thread emerged as Maigret cross-referenced the old case with his current suspects. The cabaret owner from 1912, a man named Henry Varnier, had a sister, Clarette Varnier, now known as Madame Clarette, the flower seller across the street. Lucas confirmed the link through aging marriage records. Clarette had married shortly after the robbery, taking her husband's name, but her maiden name tied her directly to the victim of Dubois' alleged crime. Her earlier eagerness to help, her vague sighting of a shadowy figure, took on a darker shade. Could she have recognized Dubois' past and sought revenge for her brother's loss, blaming him for the family's subsequent struggles? Her bitterness, already suspected over her husband's failed partnership with Dubois, now had deeper roots, a double grudge spanning decades. Maigret's thoughts turned to Gerard and Leclerc as well. Gerard's age placed him too young for direct involvement in 1912. But his shop's location next to Dubois might hide a familial connection. To the cabaret's history, perhaps a parent or uncle wronged in this same affair, Leclerc, the loan shark, could be tied through old debts from that era. If Dubois had borrowed to rebuild after the scandal, even young Pierre's fear might stem from hearing whispers of this buried history, passed down through Montmartre's rumor mill, making him a reluctant witness to something he didn't fully understand. As evening fell, Maigret returned to Rue des Martyrs, the weight of the past pressing heavier on his shoulders. The crime wasn't merely about a recent feud or debt. It was a reckoning for sins from 20 years ago, a shadow cast by La Lune Crescente over everyone near Dubois. The crescent mark on the violin was a signature of that night, a message meant for someone who remembered likely M or Madeleine if she lived. Clarette's hidden connection to the cabaret owner added a layer of motive, linking her to a vengeance that spanned generations. Maigret stood outside the antique shop, the drizzle chilling his face, knowing that these intertwined histories held the key to the locked room and the murder itself. The shadows of the past were no longer distant. They loomed over Montmartre, binding suspects in ways no one had foreseen. Maigret instructed Lucas to track down any trace of Madeleine, possibly through old cabaret contacts still alive, and to probe Clarette's family lore for confirmation of her vendetta. The truth, buried for 2 decades, was resurfacing, and Maigret felt the killer's presence closer than ever, hidden among these entangled roots, waiting to be unearthed before the shadows struck again. The drizzle had thickened into a steady rain by the time Maigret stepped back into the dimly lit antique shop on Rue des Martyrs, the weight of the past settling like dampness into his overcoat. The revelations from the archives, the robbery at La Lune Crescente, the crescent moon symbol tying Dubois to a 20-year-old crime, the potential identity of M as Madeleine, and Clarette's familial link to the cabaret owner had woven a complex web of old grudges around the murder. Yet, the locked room mystery persisted, an unsolved knot at the heart of the case. Gerard's arrest still felt like a false resolution to Maigret. The neatly placed receipt and missing candlestick too convenient. Amidst the deeper shadows of history, as night crept over Montmartre, Maigret knew he needed to shake the suspects' facades to unearth the truth hidden beneath layers of deception. He decided on an unconventional approach, a subtle test of character and memory, to provoke a reaction that might crack open the case. Maigret began by arranging a gathering under the guise of a routine update, summoning the key suspects: Madame Clarette, Gerard released on temporary bail under strict watch, young Pierre, and even Victor Leclerc, the loan shark, whose slick alibi still rankled to the shop at dusk. He instructed Lucas to spread word that new evidence had surfaced, something tied to an old symbol from Dubois' past, though he kept the specifics vague to avoid tipping his hand. The suspects arrived one by one, their faces a mix of curiosity, irritation, and guarded apprehension, as they crowded into the cramped space between the dusty shelves. Maigret stood by the workbench, his broad frame imposing under the flickering brass lamp, his pipe unlit but clenched in his teeth, projecting an air of quiet authority. "I've called you here because this case is far from closed," Maigret begun, his voice low and deliberate, cutting through the tense silence. "We've uncovered something about Du Bois, a mark from long ago, tied to a place some of you might remember. It's been etched into evidence we found here, a reminder of a night that changed lives." He paused, pulling the bagged violin fragment from his coat pocket, holding it up so the crescent mark scratched into the wood caught the faint light. He didn't elaborate on La Lune Crescente or the robbery, letting the ambiguity hang heavy in the air, watching each face for a flicker of recognition or fear. This was his unconventional tactic, not a direct accusation, but a psychological net, casting the past as bait to see who flinched under its weight. Madame Clarette's weathered hands tightened on her shawl, her sharp eyes darting to the fragment, before snapping away, her lips pressing into a thin line. Gerard, still bristling from his arrest, glowered at the piece of wood, his jaw working as if chewing on a retort. But he said nothing, his flush deepening. The clerk, leaning against a shelf with feigned nonchalance, arched an eyebrow, his smirk unwavering, though Maigret noted a subtle shift in his posture, a slight stiffening of his shoulders. But it was young Pierre who reacted most visibly. His freckled face paled, his fingers twisting the edge of his apron as they had before, his gaze fixed on the crescent mark with a raw, unguarded dread that bordered on panic. Maigret lowered the fragment, his heavy-lidded eyes lingering on Pierre as he continued, his tone deceptively mild. "This mark means something to someone here. It's a ghost from Du Bois' history, tied to a debt perhaps of money, perhaps of blood that couldn't be ignored. I'm not pointing fingers yet, but I'm close. If anyone recalls a place or a promise tied to this symbol, now's the time to speak. Before I dig deeper into old records and old secrets." He let the words settle, a quiet challenge wrapped in calm, designed to rattle nerves without forcing a corner. It was a test not just of guilt, but of memory. Those uninvolved might show confusion. The guilty, or the complicit, would betray themselves through fear or overreaction. The room remained silent for a long moment, the only sound the distant patter of rain and the creak of old wood underfoot. Clarette shifted uncomfortably, muttering under her breath about nonsense from the past. Though her voice lacked conviction, her gaze avoiding the violin piece as if it burned. Gerard grunted, folding his arms tighter, his earlier defiance now tinged with unease, though he held his tongue. Leclerc's smirk faltered for a split second, his fingers drumming briefly on the shelf before stilling an unconscious tick of irritation or nerves. But Pierre's reaction deepened. The boy's breathing grew shallow, his eyes wide and glassy, and he took an involuntary step back, bumping into a shelf with a small clatter of trinkets. I don't know nothing about that," he stammered, unprompted, his voice cracking. "I never seen it before, I swear, Inspector. I just heard the cry, like I told you." Maigret's gaze softened, but his focus sharpened on Pierre, noting the boy's unprovoked denial, the raw edge of panic in his words. It was a crack, subtle but unmistakable, in the lad's fragile composure. Pierre wasn't the killer. Maigret's instinct told him that much. The boy lacked the strength or malice for such a precise, violent act, but he knew something, or had seen something, tied to that crescent mark. Perhaps he'd overheard a name or a plan. A fragment of the past resurfacing in the wrong moment, binding him in fear to silence. Maigret didn't press him immediately. Pushing too hard now might seal the boy's lips tighter. Instead, he nodded, as if satisfied, and turned to the others. "Very well," he said, pocketing the violin fragment. "I'll be following up on this symbol. Old debts have a way of catching up. Even after 20 years, you're free to go. For now. But don't stray far. Montmartre's a small place. I'll find what I'm looking for soon enough." The dismissal was deliberate, giving each suspect room to stew in their thoughts, to wonder how much Maigret truly knew. He watched them file out into the rainy night, Claret hurrying across the street, Gerard muttering curses under his breath, Leclerc sauntering with forced ease, and Pierre lingering at the threshold, casting a haunted glance back at the workbench before dashing off. Alone again in the shop, Maigret relit his pipe, the smoke curling around him as he replayed the scene in his mind. Pierre's reaction was the key, a fissure in the wall of deception, revealing not guilt but terror, likely of someone or something connected to La Lune Crescenti. The boy's fear could stem from a direct witness to the murder or an overheard threat tied to Dubois' past, possibly involving Madeleine or Claret's deeper vendetta. The crescent mark had struck a nerve, proving its significance beyond mere coincidence. And Maigret knew he was circling closer to the heart of the mystery. He instructed Lucas, waiting outside, to keep a discreet watch on Pierre overnight, not as a suspect, but as a potential weak link who might lead them to the true killer. The unconventional tactic had worked, stirring the pot just enough to expose a crack. But the locked room and the full story of that fateful night 20 years ago still loomed unresolved. Maigret settled into the creaky chair by the workbench, the rain a steady murmur outside, sensing that the shadows of the past were drawing nearer. The killer, hidden among these tangled histories, would soon feel the net tightening, and Maigret would be ready when the next crack appeared. The rain had eased to a faint mist over Rue des Martyrs, as Maigret sat in the creaky chair by the workbench. In Dubois' antique shop, the glow of the brass lamp casting long shadows across the dusty shelves. The memory of young Pierre's panicked reaction to the crescent-marked violin fragment lingered in his mind, a subtle crack in the wall of deception that hinted at buried knowledge. The unconventional gathering had rattled the suspect's clarets. Unease, Gerard's simmering defiance, Leclerc's forced calm, and Pierre's raw fear confirming that the shadows of La Lune Crescenti still haunted Montmartre. Maigret puffed on his pipe, the smoke curling lazily as he planned his next move, to lean gently on Pierre. Through Lucas' surveillance while digging deeper into Madeleine's identity and Claret's family grudge, the truth felt closer, a tangible weight in the musty air. But as the night deepened, an unseen force was already moving to thwart him. Maigret rose to secure the evidence he'd been handling, intending to return the violin fragment to the locked evidence box at the local precinct down the street. He'd placed it temporarily in a small tin on the workbench after the gathering, alongside the envelope containing the glass shard from the cracked lamp. Trusting the shop's relative seclusion for the hour or so he'd remained. But as he reached for the tin, His thick fingers paused mid-motion. Its lid was slightly ajar, though he was certain he'd closed it tight. A prickle of unease crept up his spine as he opened it fully. The violin fragment with the crescent mark, the linchpin tying Du Bois' murder to his past, was gone. The glass shard remained, untouched, but the absence of the marked wood was a glaring void, as if someone had plucked the heart from his investigation. His heavy-lidded eyes narrowed, scanning the room with methodical precision. The dust on the floor showed no fresh footprints beyond his own and those from the earlier gathering, and the rusted bolt on the front door remained undisturbed. The tiny back window, still grimy and intact, offered no signs of forced entry. Yet, the theft was undeniable. Someone had slipped in and out, or had been among the suspects during the meeting. Seizing a fleeting moment when Maigret's attention was elsewhere, the precision of it chilled him. This wasn't a random act of desperation, but a calculated strike to bury a clue that threatened to expose the killer. Trust, already thin on Rue des Martyrs, frayed further in his mind. Who among his circle, or even within the gendarmerie, could be working against him? Maigret summoned Lucas immediately, the sergeant arriving breathless within minutes, his face clouding with concern at the news. "I locked up the precinct evidence room myself, Inspector," Lucas insisted, his voice tight. "No one's been near the shop since the suspects left. I've had a man posted outside, as you ordered." Could it have been misplaced during the meeting? One of them might have palmed it while you were speaking. Maigret shook his head, his jaw set. "I had eyes on them, Lucas. Not constantly, perhaps, but enough." This wasn't a sleight of hand in the moment it was planned. Someone knew the fragment's value, knew it pointed to La Lune Crescente and Du Bois' bust. They waited until the room cleared, or found another way in. "Check with your man outside." Did he step away, even for a minute, and get a list of everyone who's had access to this shop since yesterday? Lucas nodded, hurrying off to interrogate the guard, while Maigret paced the cramped space, his mind racing over the implications. The vanishing evidence raised the stakes, transforming the case from a puzzle of history into an active battle against an unseen adversary. The killer, or an accomplice, was close watching his every move, bold enough to infiltrate a guarded crime scene. Pierre's terror during the gathering took on a darker hue. Had the boys seen something that night? Someone who now sought to silence any trace of their identity. Clarette's connection to the cabaret owner, Henry Varnier, made her a candidate. Her bitterness over past losses could drive her to destroy links to that night. Leclerc, with his underworld reach, had the means to orchestrate such a theft through hired hands, preserving his polished alibi. Even Gerard, despite his arrest, might have allies on the street, eager to clear his name by erasing evidence that could circle back to deeper truths. Maigret's thoughts drifted to the gendarmerie itself, the rushed declaration of Gerard's guilt by the magistrate, the eager headlines someone in authority might be pushing for a quick close. Wary of old scandals resurfacing, a corrupt officer or clerk, tipped off about the fragment's significance, could have acted under orders or for personal gain. Trust, a fragile thread in any investigation, snapped under the weight of this betrayal. Maigret resolved to keep his next moves closer to his chest, sharing only with Lucas, whose loyalty he still believed in, though doubt now shadowed even that certainty. As dawn approached, Lucas returned with grim news. The guard outside admitted to a brief lapse, stepping around the corner for a cigarette during a quiet spell after the suspects dispersed. Less than 5 minutes, he swore, but enough for a swift hand to slip inside through an unlocked back door or a moment of distraction. No other witnesses had come forward, and the list of shop access was limited to the suspects, gendarmes, and coroner's team. Maigret grunted, dismissing the guard with a stern warning. Knowing the lapse was likely exploited by someone already poised to strike, he ordered a sweep of the alley and surrounding stalls for the fragment, though he suspected it was long gone destroyed or hidden beyond immediate reach. Standing alone in the shop, the first light of day filtering through the grimy window, Maigret relit his pipe, the familiar ritual grounding him amidst rising tension. The theft of the violin fragment was a desperate act, proof that his probe into the past had struck a nerve. Without the physical mark, tying the murder to La Lune Crescenti relied on testimony and archived records still damning, but less visceral, harder to wield in confrontation. Yet, Maigret saw an opportunity in the loss. The thief's boldness betrayed their proximity, narrowing the field. Whoever took it feared exposure through that crescent symbol. Likely someone with direct memory of 1912 Claret, or the elusive Madeleine, if she lived. He instructed Lucas to double surveillance on Pierre, whose fear might now push him to break under pressure and to hasten the search for Madeleine through old cabaret contacts, suspecting her as the M whose letters bore such pain. Maigret also quietly requested a background check on key gendarmes involved, a precaution against internal sabotage. The stakes had soared with the vanishing evidence. The killer wasn't just covering tracks, but actively fighting to bury the truth. The locked room, the broken violin, the shadows of 20 years ago all felt more ominous now, as if the past itself conspired against him. Maigret stepped outside, the mist cool on his face, his gaze sweeping the waking street. Trust was fractured, but his resolve hardened. Someone on Rue des Martyrs was desperate enough to steal from under his nose, and that desperation was a weakness he could exploit. The truth, though obscured, was still within reach, and Maigret would pursue it through the fog of betrayal, knowing the killer's next move might be their last mistake. The mist clung to Rue des Martyrs as Maigret stood outside the antique shop, the early morning chill seeping into his bones while his mind churned over the theft of the violin fragment with its damning crescent mark. The calculated disappearance of such a crucial piece of evidence had heightened the stakes, confirming that the killer or an accomplice was not only close, but actively working to bury the truth of Etienne Dubois' murder. The shadows of La Lune Crescenti, the lingering grudges from 20 years past, and the fractured trust within his own investigative circle weighed heavily on him. Yet, Maigret's resolve remained unshaken. The desperation behind the theft was a vulnerability, a sign that the killer felt the net tightening. He puffed on his pipe, the smoke dissolving into the foggy air. As he planned his next steps, pressing Pierre for what he knew, tracing Madeleine, and guarding against internal betrayal. But before the day could fully break, the case took a violent, unexpected turn, proving the villain was still several steps ahead. As Maigret turned to re-enter the shop, intending to comb through Dubois' loft once more for overlooked clues, a sharp cry pierced the quiet street. It came from the direction of the bakery, just a few doors down, where young Pierre worked under his stern master. His pulse quickened, though his broad frame moved with deliberate calm, boots crunching on the damp cobblestone as he hastened toward the source. A small crowd of early risers, street vendors, and a milkman had already gathered near the bakery's entrance, their murmurs laced with alarm. Pushing through, Maigret's gaze fell on a grim scene. Pierre lay slumped against the shop's doorframe, his freckled face deathly pale, blood seeping from a jagged wound on the side of his head, matting his sandy hair. His apron was torn, and his hands, still clutching a broom as if caught mid-task, trembled faintly with the last vestiges of life. Maigret knelt beside the boy, his thick fingers searching for a pulse while barking at a bystander to fetch a doctor. And Lucas from the precinct. Pierre's heartbeat was faint, fluttering beneath Maigret's touch, but his shallow breaths signaled he might not hold on long. His glassy eyes flickered toward Maigret, a whisper escaping his bloodied lips. Saw. Crescent. Didn't mean to, before he slipped into unconsciousness. The words, fragmented and weak, confirmed Maigret's suspicion. Pierre had seen something tied to that symbol, likely the killer or a crucial detail from the night of Dubois' murder, and now someone had struck to silence him before he could. Crack under pressure. Lucas arrived alongside a harried doctor minutes later, the latter grimly assessing Pierre's condition as critical blunt trauma, likely from a heavy object, mirroring Dubois' fatal wound. The boy was rushed to a nearby hospital, leaving Maigret and Lucas to secure the scene. No weapon was immediately visible, though a smear of blood on the cobblestone near the alley suggested the attack had occurred there. Before Pierre staggered to the door, witnesses offered scattered accounts. A flower vendor heard a muffled thud just before dawn, assuming it was a crate falling. The milkman saw a shadowed figure in a dark coat fleeing down the alley. Moments before the cry, too fleeting to describe. Maigret's jaw tightened, his mind racing. This wasn't just an escalation. It was a ruthless assertion of control, proving the killer was watching, anticipating his moves, and willing to kill again to protect their secret, the investigation. Already a labyrinth of past sins and vanishing evidence, took a sharp turn into urgent territory. Maigret now faced not just the unraveling of Dubois' murder, but the desperate need to prevent another death. Pierre's, if he survived, or anyone else who might hold a piece of the truth. The attack on the boy shattered any lingering doubt that the villain operated alone or impulsively. This was a calculated predator, several steps ahead, likely embedded deeply in the web of La Lune Crescenti's history. Maigret's earlier focus on Clarette's grudge, Madeleine's letters, and Leclerc's underworld ties intensified. Someone among them, or connected to them, had the reach and motive for such a bold strike. He instructed Lucas to double the guard at the hospital, ensuring Pierre, if he woke, would be protected and questioned immediately. Simultaneously, He ordered a thorough canvass of the alley for traces of the attacker footprints. Dropped items, anything to narrow the fleeting shadow into a tangible lead. Maigret himself lingered at the bakery, speaking with Pierre's master, a burly man named Henry, whose gruff demeanor masked a visible shake in his hands as he recounted the morning. The lad was sweeping out front. As always, Henry muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. I was in the back, kneading dough. Didn't hear a thing till the shouting started. He's a good boy. Inspector, never in trouble. Why him? Maigret noted the genuine concern, but also a flicker of evasion in Henry's eyes. Did he know more about Pierre's fear? Perhaps a whispered confidence, now deadly relevant? The second crime injected a raw urgency into the case, reshaping Maigret's approach. Trust, already fragile after the fragments theft, became a luxury he couldn't afford. Even Lucas' loyalty, though steadfast so far, lingered under a shadow of doubt as internal leaks remained a possibility. The parallels between Pierre's attack and Dubois' murder blunt trauma, precise and sudden, suggested the same hand, driven by desperation to bury the crescent symbol's significance. Pierre's mumbled words, saw, crescent, echoed. In Maigret's mind, a haunting clue that the boy had witnessed something tied to that mark. Perhaps the killer wielding it as a threat or signature on the night Dubois died. As the morning wore on, grey and damp, Maigret stood in the alley where the attack occurred, his pipe cold between his teeth, scanning the narrow passage for overlooked details. A scuff of mud near a crate caught his eye, not a distinct print, but a sign of haste, matching the milkman's account of a fleeing figure. The killer's boldness unnerved him, striking in near daylight, within earshot of witnesses, spoke of either supreme confidence or reckless panic. Maigret suspected the latter. Pierre's reaction during the gathering had marked him as a loose end, and the thief of the violin fragment likely feared what else the boy might reveal if pushed. The stakes now transcended solving a single murder. Maigret bore the weight of protecting lives still in the killer's crosshairs. He resolved to hasten the search for Madeleine, whose letters as M might hold the heart of the motive, and to confront Clarette directly about her brothers. Passed at La Lune Crescenti, probing for any recent contact or allies who might act on her behalf. Leclerc's reach couldn't be ignored. Either violence was his trade, and silencing a witness fit his profile. Even Gerard, on bail, warranted scrutiny. His temper might mask a broader network. Maigret trudged back to the antique shop, the mist veiling Montmartre in uncertainty, his mind a steel trap clamping tighter around the case. The villain was ahead, striking with lethal precision, but every move revealed a little more fear of exposure, knowledge of the Crescent's power. Maigret would turn that fear against them, racing to uncover the truth before another life bled out on these cobblestone streets. The locked room, the broken violin, the shadows of 20 years ago all converged now in a desperate chase, and Maigret felt the killer's breath closer than ever, daring him to catch up before the next blow fell. The mist hung low over Rue des Martyrs as Maigret trudged back to the antique shop, the weight of the morning's violence pressing hard on his broad shoulders. The brutal attack on young Pierre, still clinging to life in a hospital bed, had shifted the case into a frantic race against a killer who struck with ruthless precision. To silence loose ends, the parallels to Du Bois' murder blunt trauma. Sudden and calculated underscored a desperate need to protect potential targets. While unraveling the mystery rooted in the shadows of La Lune Crescente, the stolen violin fragment, Pierre's whispered mention of the crescent, and the lingering questions of trust within his own ranks gnawed at Maigret. But amidst the chaos, his mind clung to details, sifting through the fog of deception for clarity. As he stepped back into the dusty shop, the faint creak of the floorboards under his boots grounding him, a pattern began to emerge, subtle, almost invisible until now, but suddenly, searingly clear. Maigret settled into the creaky chair by the workbench, relighting his pipe as the grey light of late morning filtered through the grimy window. He spread out his notebook, reviewing scribbled observations from the past days, the locked room, the broken violin, the crescent mark, the letters from M, the glass shard from the cracked lamp, and now Pierre's attack. His gaze drifted to the workbench itself, where Du Bois had spent his final moments, and landed on a small, seemingly trivial item he'd noted but dismissed in the initial sweep, a worn leather-bound ledger, tucked among tools and with scraps, its pages yellowed, and filled with cryptic notations of repairs and sales. He'd skimmed it before, finding nothing immediate, but now, with the weight of 2 crimes and a killer on the loose, he opened it again, driven by an instinct that small details often hid the largest truths, flipping through the brittle pages. Maigret's thick fingers paused on an entry dated a month prior, scrawled in Du Bois' shaky hand. Violin restoring, crescent client, urgent, no fee. The words struck him like a quiet thunderclap. Crescent client echoed the symbol on the broken violin, a direct reference to La Lune Crescente or someone tied to it. And the notation of no fee suggested a personal obligation, perhaps a debt of honor or fear. Maigret traced back through earlier entries, finding 2 more mentions of this crescent client over the past year, both tied to violin work repairs or tuning, always marked as unpaid. It was a pattern hidden in plain sight, overlooked amidst the chaos of murder and theft. Du Bois had been maintaining a connection to someone from his past, tied to that fateful night 20 years ago. And the violin wasn't just a victim of random destruction, it was the very nexus of the grudge. His mind raced, connecting this small detail to the broader case. The violin, etched with the crescent mark, wasn't shattered in anger during a struggle. It was destroyed deliberately, a symbolic act of severing a tie or exacting revenge for whatever crescent client represented. Maigret recalled Pierre's terrified reaction to the fragment during the gathering. His mumbled saw, crescent after the attack likely. The boy had overheard or glimpsed this client, or the mark itself, in connection with Du Bois' death, marking him as a threat to be silenced. The pattern clarified further. The killer wasn't just covering tracks from a single crime, but purging any remnant of a shared history with Du Bois. A history centered on that violin and the unpaid debts, emotional or otherwise tied to La Lune Crescente. Maigret leaned back, the pipe smoke curling around him as the ledger's significance deepened. The crescent client had to be someone from 1912 Madeleine, the singer from the old photograph, whose letters as M bore such longing and bitterness, or Claret. whose brother owned the cabaret and whose family suffered after the robbery, or even an unknown figure. Perhaps the accomplice Marcel who served time while Du Bois walked free. The lack of payment hinted at coercion or guilt on Du Bois' part, a lingering obligation that festered into motive for murder. When something, perhaps a recent encounter or demand, reignited old wounds. The key had been in plain sight all along, not in dramatic evidence like the stolen fragment, but in the mundane record of a shopkeeper's debts, a quiet testament to a past never truly buried. The realization reframed the locked room mystery as well. If the violin was the motive's centerpiece, the killer might have had a hidden means of access tied to their long-standing relationship with Du Bois, perhaps a forgotten key, or knowledge of a concealed entry from years of clandestine visits. For those unpaid repairs, Maigret stood, pacing the shop with renewed focus, examining the walls and floor near the workbench for signs of a hidden panel or trapdoor, something a trusted client might know. Near the back corner, beneath a stack of old crates, he found a faint outline in the dusty seam in the floorboards, barely noticeable. That lifted with a quiet creak to reveal a shallow crawl space, just wide enough for a person to slip through. From an unseen alley access, dust undisturbed on the surface had masked it, but faint scuffs below suggested recent use. The locked room wasn't magic. It was memory, exploited by someone who knew Du Bois' secrets. The pattern sharpened every aspect of the case. The glass shard from the cracked lamp, likely broken in a struggle, tied to a hurried exit through this crawl space. The stolen fragment, taken to erase the crescents linked to the ledger's client, Pierre's attack. A desperate silencing of a witness to this person's identity. Maigret's unease with Gerard's arrest now made sense. The shopkeeper might have a grudge, but he lacked the depth of history to be the crescent client. Clarette, with her brother's loss, or Madeleine, with her intimate past, fit better. Though Leclerc's predatory nature couldn't be dismissed if he'd unearthed this history for leverage. As the afternoon grayed into dusk, Maigret summoned Lucas with urgency, sharing the ledger's revelation while keeping the crawl space quiet for now. Wary of further betrayal, focus on Pierre's condition at the hospital. He instructed, voice low, if he wakes. Ask about anyone Du Bois met regularly, anyone tied to violins or old debts. And push harder for Madeleine, her name's likely tied to this client. Entry. Check Clarette's recent movements too. Her family tie to the cabaret makes her a ghost in this pattern. Lucas nodded, sensing the shift in momentum, while Maigret pocketed the ledger, securing it on his person to prevent another vanishing act. Standing by the shop's window, watching the mist swirl over Montmartre, Maigret felt the case pivot beneath him. The chaos, the deaths, the theft. The attacks had obscured a simple truth scribbled in Du Bois' own hand. The crescent client. Was the thread weaving through 20 years of silence to now? A name and a face he was closing in on. The killer had struck to bury this pattern, but in doing so, had only illuminated it further. Maigret's resolve hardened. The key had been here all along, in plain sight amidst the clutter, and now he would follow its trail through the shadows of La Lune Crescente. Before the next life was claimed, the mist over Rue des Martyrs had thickened into a somber veil. As dusk deepened, casting the narrow street in muted grey while Maigret stood by the grimy window of Du Bois' antique shop. The pattern that had emerged from the mundane pages of the leather-bound ledger, the repeated entries for a Crescent client tied to unpaid violin repairs, had reframed the entire case, illuminating a thread of history woven through 20 years of silence from La Lune Crescenti to the present murders. The discovery of the hidden crawl space beneath the floorboards solved the locked room enigma, proving the killer was someone intimate with Du Bois' life, exploiting old secrets to move unseen. With young Pierre still unconscious in the hospital, a target of the killer's desperate silencing, and the violin fragment stolen to bury the crescent symbol's significance, Maigret felt the net tightening around the elusive Crescent client as he secured the ledger in his coat pocket, resolved to follow its trail through the shadows of Montmartre. A breakthrough loomed, one that would reveal a motive far darker and more shocking than he'd anticipated, exposing the depths of the villain's tormented psyche. Maigret sat back at the workbench, his pipe glowing faintly under the brass lamp's light, awaiting Lucas' return with updates on Pierre's condition and the search for Madeleine, the likely M of the love letters. The letter's entries gnawed at him, urgent. No fee suggested not just a debt, but a compulsion. A bond that kept Du Bois tethered to this client despite financial loss. Greed or petty revenge over the 1912 robbery didn't fully fit. The symbolic destruction of the violin, marked with the crescent, and the lethal urgency to silence Pierre hinted at an obsession, a wound deeper than money or power. Maigret's thoughts churned over the suspect's claret, tied to her brother's ruined cabaret, the clerk, the predatory loan shark, and Madeleine, the ghostly lover from Du Bois' pastiche with potential grudges, but none yet explaining the visceral need to erase every trace of that shared history. Lucas arrived near evening, his face weary but taut with news, as he reported a breakthrough from an old cabaret contact tracked down in a seedy Montmartre tavern. Madeleine's alive, Inspector, he said, voice low. Goes by Madeleine Fournier now, widowed, living in a tenement near Pigalle. She sang at La Lune Crescenti back in 12. Knew Du Bois intimately. Rumor is they were lovers until the robbery tore everything apart. She's kept quiet for years, but the contact says she's been seen near Rue des Martyrs recently, asking after old acquaintances. I've got her address. We can bring her in tonight if you want. Lucas paused, adding, Pierre's still out, no change, but the guard's tight at the hospital. Nothing new on Claret's movements yet. Maigret nodded, his heavy-lidded eyes narrowing with focus. Madeleine's proximity and timing reappearing after decades. Near the scene of the crime fit the Crescent client profile. Her letters as M echoing a pain that could have festered into lethal intent. He directed Lucas to arrange a discreet visit to her tenement, avoiding official channels to prevent leaks. While he mulled over the ledger's implications, the urgency of no-fee repairs tied to a symbol of their shared past suggested Du Bois wasn't just maintaining a violin, but atoning. Perhaps for abandoning Madeleine after the robbery, or for a betrayal during that chaotic night. Maigret sensed the motive was personal, rooted in emotional scars. But its true depth eluded him until a seemingly routine follow-up shifted everything. While awaiting Lucas' preparations, Maigret received a call from the hospital. Pierre had briefly regained consciousness, mumbling incoherently to a nurse before slipping back under. The words, scribbled by the nurse and relayed over the line, were fragmented but chilling. Woman, crescent pin. Sorry. Violin broke her. Maigret's pulse quickened, though his expression remained impassive. A woman wearing the crescent pin, likely a brooch or emblem tied directly to the La Lune Croissante symbol. And the phrase violin broke her suggested not physical destruction, but emotional ruin. A shattering tied to the instrument itself. Pierre must have seen this woman near Dubois' shop, possibly on the night of the murder. Her presence so tied to the violin's fate that it haunted him into silence. Until violence forced the fragments out, the pieces snapped into place as Maigret connected Pierre's words to Madeleine. A crescent pin would be a personal memento, a remnant of her cabaret days, worn as a badge of identity or pain. He recalled the letters signed M, the last one mentioning a debt unpaid, with a bitter edge, hinting at more than money, a life derailed, perhaps by Dubois' actions after 1912. Maigret instructed Lucas to meet him at Madeleine's address immediately, sensing the motive's revelation was near, and within the hour. They stood outside a crumbling tenement in Pigalle, the air heavy, with the stench of damp plaster and despair. Madeleine Fournier answered the door, a gaunt woman in her late 50s, her dark eyes sunken but sharp, her graying hair pinned back with a small, tarnished crescent brooch glinting at her collar. Her face tightened at the sight of Maigret's official bearing, but she allowed them in. Her cramped room cluttered with faded sheet music and a cracked mirror reflecting her weary form. Maigret's tone was gentle but unyielding as he mentioned Dubois, the violin, and the crescent symbol. Watching her reaction, her hands trembled, clutching a shawl, and her voice broke as she murmured, "I knew he'd never forget, but I couldn't let him play it again. Not after what it cost me." Under Maigret's steady gaze, the dam broke. Madeleine's story poured out, raw and jagged, a lover's tale turned tragic. She and Dubois had been inseparable in 1912, planning a future built on music at La Lune Croissante, until the robbery, partly his idea to fund their escape, went awry. Dubois abandoned her when suspicion fell, fleeing blame while she miscarried their child under the stress of scandal and ostracism. Her singing career ruined by association. The violin, his prized possession, became her symbol of betrayal. Each note he played was a taunt of the life she lost. For years she hid, rebuilding in anonymity. But seeing him thriving in Montmartre decades later, still playing that cursed instrument, reignited her agony. The unpaid repairs in the ledger were her demands, not for money, but for silent threats to stop playing. To let her grief restore, she'd destroy the violin herself. Her motive wasn't revenge in the classic sense, nor greed, but a profound, obsessive need to erase the sound of her shattered dreams. Killing Dubois wasn't planned. She'd slipped into the shop via the crawl space she knew from old visits, intending only to smash the violin. But when he caught her and mocked her pain, "You're still broken, aren't you?" her rage erupted, striking him with a heavy, stool from the workbench. Pierre saw her leaving, noticed the crescent pin, and her panic drove the second attack to protect her fragile, rebuilt existence. The stolen fragment was her final act to bury the symbol of her loss. Maigret listened, his face unreadable, as the shocking depth of her motive sank in not a cold vendetta, but a wounded psyche pushed to extremes by unhealed trauma, willing to kill to silence a melody that echoed her ruin. Her confession laid bare a desperation few could fathom, a mind warped by decades of silent suffering. He signaled Lucas to take her into custody, her resistance gone, her crescent pin glinting dully as she was led away. Standing in the tenement's dim hall, Maigret felt the case's weight lift, yet a somber chill remained. The hidden motive, grief, twisted into obsession, had driven Madeleine to such lengths, a truth darker than any mercenary gain. The locked room, the broken violin. The violent soul stemmed from a broken heart's refusal to hear the past played again. Maigret knew paperwork and testimony awaited, but for now, he stepped into the night, the mist of Montmartre cloaking him, the sound of an unseen violin lingering in his mind as a haunting reminder of pain's deadly power. The mist of Montmartre swirled thickly around Maigret as he stepped out of the crumbling tenement. In the gale, the weight of Madeleine Fournier's confession settling into his bones like the damp night air. The revelation of her motive, a grief-stricken obsession to silence the violin, that embodied her shattered dreams after the La Lune Crescenti robbery had unveiled a darkness far deeper than mere revenge or greed. Her admission to Dubois' murder, driven by a decades-old wound reopened by the taunt of his music, and her desperate attack on Pierre to protect her fragile anonymity, tied every thread of the case together. The crescent mark, the broken instrument, the locked room accessed via a hidden crawl space, and the stolen fragment meant to bury her past. As Lucas led her away in cuffs, her gaunt frame sagging under the burden of her actions, Maigret knew the final act awaited, a confrontation to solidify her guilt with irrefutable evidence and ensure no loose ends remained. Though the truth was in hand, the tension coiled tighter than ever. Madeleine's tormented psyche hinted at a fragility that could snap in unpredictable ways. Maigret returned to the Quai des Orfèvres under the cover of night, the precincts, dim corridors echoing with the murmur of late-shift officers. He directed Lucas to place Madeleine in a holding cell, isolated from others to prevent disturbances, while he coordinated with the hospital for an update on Pierre's condition. The boy, though still critical, had stabilized slightly, whispering fragments to a guarded nurse about a woman with a moonpin near the shop on the night. Dubois died a confirmation of Madeleine's presence that bolstered the case. Maigret also secured the leather-bound ledger retrieved from his coat pocket, its entries of the Crescent client serving as a written link to her demands on Dubois. With these pieces aligning the confession, witness corroboration, and documentary evidence, he prepared for the final confrontation, not in the heat of pursuit, but in the cold clarity of strategy, setting a trap to test her resolve and seal the investigation beyond doubt. By the early hours, Maigret sat across from Madeleine in a stark interrogation room, the single overhead light casting harsh shadows on her hollow cheeks, and the tarnished crescent brooch pinned to her shawl, now a grim emblem of her motive. Her eyes, though weary, held a flicker of defiance mingled with resignation, as if she knew the end neared but clung to some unspoken hope. Maigret's broad frame filled the chair opposite, his pipe unlit between his teeth, his heavy-lidded gaze steady and unyielding, projecting a calm that belied the peak of tension beneath. He had all the pieces in place her emotional collapse. In the gale, Pierre's testimony, the crawl space solving the Locktrum riddle, and the ledger's damning entries, but he needed her to confirm the details under pressure, to close any chance of retraction or legal doubt. More crucially, he suspected her instability might provoke a final desperate act, and he was prepared to turn it to his advantage. "Madeleine," he began, his voice low and measured, almost paternal, "you've told me why you struck Du Bois his violin, his mockery, the pain of what you lost. I understand grief. It can twist a heart until it breaks. But I need the full truth now, every step of that night. For the record, you entered through the crawl space, didn't you? You smashed the violin, marked with your old cabaret's symbol, and when he fought back, you took a tool from the bench. Tell me how it unfolded, and how you silenced Pierre when he saw too much." He slid the ledger across the table, opened to the Crescent client page, alongside a photograph of the broken violin fragment recovered from evidence records. Before its theft, the bait was deliberate, confronting her with tangible reminders of her actions, gauging if guilt or fear would push her to confess fully or crack in a last bid for escape. Madeleine's fingers twitched, her gaze darting between the ledger and the photo, the crescent mark a silent accusation. For a long moment she remained mute, her lips trembling, but then her voice rasped out, brittle as dry leaves. "Yes, I used the old crawl space, knew it from years ago. When we hide from creditors, I only meant to break that cursed thing. Stop its sound tearing through me again." But Etienne laughed, called me broken, and I grabbed the mallet. "I didn't plan to kill, Inspector. I swear, just to stop him." Her voice cracked on the admission, tears streaking her face. But when Maigret pressed about Pierre, her eyes hardened. The boy saw me leave, stared at my brooch like he knew. I couldn't let him speak. I followed him at dawn, used a brick from the alley. I had to protect what little I have left. Maigret nodded, his expression impassive, though inwardly the tension thrummed. Her confession matched Pierre's fragmented account, and the physical evidence, cementing her guilt for both crimes. Yet he sensed her volatility, the way her hands clenched as if grasping for control. He leaned forward slightly, voice still calm, pushing the trap's spring. "You stole the fragment too, didn't you? To bury the crescent, your past. Where is it now, Madeleine? Help me close this, and the court might see your pain, not just your acts." He watched her closely, anticipating a reaction. Confession of the theft's details could seal the timeline. But her fractured mind might seize this as a final chance to deflect or lash out. Her reaction came swiftly, a desperate edge igniting in her gaze as she lunged forward, not with fists, but with words, her voice rising to a shriek. "I burned it. That cursed mark is ash, gone like my life should have been. You can't drag it up again. Inspector, I'll say nothing more. Let me go. Let me forget. Her sudden outburst, slamming her hands on the table, was a fraying of restraint, and Maigret saw the instinct to flee in her wild eyes. She half rose, as if to bolt for the door, but Maigret's composure held firm. He gestured subtly to Lucas, stationed outside the room's small window, ensuring no escape was possible. His voice remained steady, cutting through her panic. Sit. Madeleine, there's nowhere to run. Burning the fragment changes nothing your story. Pierre's words. To Boyce Ledger they trap you tighter than any wood scrap. Speak or don't. I have enough. Her shoulders slumped, the fight draining as she sank back into the chair, sobbing quietly, the crescent brooch seeming to weigh heavier on her frail frame. Maigret knew the trap had worked not in forcing a dramatic escape attempt, but in breaking her last defense under the pressure of inescapable truth. Her confession of burning the fragment aligned with the killer's desperation to erase history, and her collapse under interrogation solidified her statements, leaving no room for legal evasion. He stood, signaling Lucas to formalize the charges, while he stepped to the room's edge, relighting his pipe, the smoke curling like the tension unwinding round him. The final confrontation had peaked and passed, not in a chase across Montmartre, but in the sterile confines of a precinct room, where Maigret's quiet persistence outlasted Madeleine's fractured will. He lingered a moment, gazing through the narrow window at the dark city beyond, knowing the paperwork, testimony, and Pierre's hopeful recovery awaited. The case, the locked room, the broken violin, the shadows of La Lune Crescenti lay resolved, its pieces finally in place, bound by a motive of grief turned deadly. Maigret's composure masked the weariness beneath. He had faced the villains, desperation, and won, not with force, but with patience, ensuring no further blood stained these cobblestone streets. The night held Montmartre in silence now, and Maigret turned back to the task of closing this haunting chapter. One final note in a melody of loss now stilled. The silence of midnight enveloped the Quai des Orfèvres as Maigret stood by the narrow window of the interrogation room, the faint glow of his relit pipe casting wisps of smoke into the dim air. The final confrontation with Madeleine Fournier had unfolded with tense precision. Her confession to Dubois' murder, driven by a grief-fueled obsession to silence the violin of her shattered dreams, and her admission to attacking Pierre and burning the crescent-marked fragment, had sealed the case. Her collapse under the weight of inescapable truth, her desperate outburst quelled by Maigret's unshakable composure, marked the end of a haunting investigation. The pieces the locked room solved by the hidden crawl space, the ledger's crescent client entries, Pierre's fragmented testimony fit together, a tragic mosaic of loss turned lethal. As Lucas finalized the charges and paperwork loomed, Maigret felt the case's weight lift, the quiet of Montmartre beyond mirroring a hard-won resolution. Yet, just as the file seemed ready to close, a last-minute twist emerged from the shadows, testing his genius one final time with a revelation that shattered the apparent clarity. Maigret turned from the window, intending to review the formal confession transcript before retiring for a few hours of rest, when Lucas burst into the room, his face pale and urgent under the harsh overhead light. "Inspector, you need to see this now," he said, voice tight, holding out a crumpled letter retrieved from Madeleine's tenement during a follow-up evidence sweep. It was hidden in a false bottom of a drawer, missed in the initial search. It's dated just a week before Du Bois' death, and it's not in her handwriting. Look at the signature. Maigret took the letter, his heavy fingers smoothing the creased paper under the lamp, his pulse quickening despite his impassive mask. The script was sharp, masculine, and the signature read V. Leclerc, the loan shark whose slick alibi and predatory nature had lingered on the edges of suspicion. The content was brief but damning. Madeleine, finish what we started at La Lune. He owes us both. I've cleared the path, use it. Don't falter now. VL his mind raced. The neat resolution fracturing under this new weight. Victor Leclerc, with his underworld reach and calculated charm, hadn't just been a peripheral figure. He appeared to be the puppet master, orchestrating Madeleine's actions. The phrase finish what we started at La Lune, tied directly to the 1912 robbery at La Lune Crescente, suggesting Leclerc had a stake in that night, perhaps as the accomplice Marcel, who served time while Du Bois escaped blame, or as a silent investor wronged by the fallout, cleared the path hinted at his role in smoothing obstacles, possibly bribing the guard during the violin fragment's theft, or providing Madeleine with precise timing for her strikes. Maigret's earlier unease with the case's tidy closure resurfaced Madeleine's emotional frailty, made her an unlikely lone strategist for such precise cover-ups. Someone with colder cunning had to be guiding her hand. The revelation shook the investigation's foundation, transforming Madeleine from sole villain to a manipulated tool. Her obsession weaponized by a mastermind who exploited her pain for his own ends. Maigret's genius was tested anew. He had to pivot from wrapping up a tragic crime of passion to unmasking a deeper, calculating force before Leclerc slipped through the cracks of an assumed resolution. He instructed Lucas to keep the letter under strict confidentiality, wary of internal leaks, and to summon Leclerc immediately under the guise of a routine follow-up, avoiding any hint of the new evidence to prevent him from bolting. Meanwhile, Maigret revisited the case's details with this twist in mind, piecing together how Leclerc fit as the unseen architect. Leclerc's alibi for Du Bois' murder night drinking with associates at a distant bar had been too polished to readily corroborated by witnesses likely in his debt. His feigned nonchalance during the suspect gathering, the subtle tick of nerves when the crescent mark was shown, now read as controlled awareness, not ignorance. The loan shark's trade in debts aligned with exploiting old grudges, if he was Marcel or tied to the cabaret's losses. He'd have nursed a vendetta against Du Bois for escaping justice, using Madeleine's personal agony as a blade while keeping his hands clean. The theft of the fragment, requiring insider knowledge of police movements, and the near-daylight attack on Pierre pointed to resources and boldness beyond Madeleine's fractured state. Leclerc's network could easily arrange such acts through proxies. By the early dawn, Leclerc arrived at the precinct, his tailored coat and smirk intact, though a flicker of wariness crossed his sharp eyes as he sat across from Maigret. In the same stark room where Madeleine had broken, Maigret's composure held, his pipe cold between his teeth, projecting the same quiet authority that had undone Madeleine, but inwardly, tension from this was no longer a case of grief, but of cold-blooded manipulation. He began indirectly, referencing the La Lune Crescenti robbery, watching Leclerc's reaction to mentions of Marcel and unpaid debts. The loan shark's smirk twitched, a crack in his veneer, but he deflected with practiced ease, claiming vague memories of Montmartre's old haunts and no personal stake. Maigret then laid the trap, sliding the letter across the table without preamble, its sharp handwriting and signature VL exposed under the light. "Care to explain this, Monsieur Leclerc?" he asked, voice low and unrelenting. "You guided Madeleine Fournier to kill Dubois, used her pain as your weapon. You cleared the path, bribes, tips, maybe even arranging the fragments theft to bury your shared past. I've got enough to hold you as an accomplice. Or worse, the mind behind it all. Speak now, or I dig until every debt you've ever called in buries you." Leclerc's face hardened, the smirk vanishing as his fingers tightened briefly on the table's edge, a predator cornered but calculating. "That's no proof, Inspector," he hissed, voice smooth despite the pressure. "A letter could be forged. I knew Madeleine, sure, old ties from the cabaret days. But I didn't push her to anything. She's mad with grief, blame her, not me." Yet his eyes betrayed a flicker of panic, darting to the door as if measuring escape. And Maigret knew he'd struck the nerve. He leaned forward, unrelenting. "I've got men checking your associates now, Leclerc. One crack in that alibi, one witness tying you to the fragments theft or Pierre's attack, and you're done. Madeleine's testimony will turn. Under pressure she'll name you to lessen her weight. Your paths closing." The room pulsed with silent tension. Leclerc's silence, a fragile shield, as Maigret held his gaze. Knowing he lacked hard evidence, yet to pin him fully only the letter's implication and circumstantial ties. But his genius lay in patience, not haste. He signaled Lucas to detain Leclerc pending further investigation into his 1912 alias and recent movements, buying time to unearth corroboration. The last-minute twist had upended the case's closure. Madeleine was the hand, but Leclerc, likely the mind, loomed as the true mastermind. A puppeteer of pain whose reach extended beyond one tragic act. Maigret stepped into the precinct corridor, the dawn grey beyond the windows, weariness mingling with resolve. The case wasn't open and shut. It demanded one final push to dismantle Leclerc's web before he slithered free. The shadows of La Lune Crescenti stretched longer than ever, and Maigret's mind, tested to its limit, steeled for the hunt. Knowing Montmartre's silence hid one last secret waiting to bleed into the light, the grey dawn crept through the narrow windows of the Quai des Orfèvres, casting a pallid light over the precinct's worn corridors as Maigret stood alone, the faint scent of pipe tobacco lingering round him. The last-minute twist, the crumpled letter from Victor Leclerc to Madeleine Fournier, revealing his role as the likely mastermind behind Dubois' murder, had shattered the case's apparent resolution. Madeleine's confession, driven by grief over a lost life tied to La Lune Crescenti, had made her the hand of violence. But Leclerc's chilling note, urging her to finish what we started and claiming to have cleared the path, positioned him as the calculating mind, exploiting her pain for his own vendetta, with Leclerc detained pending deeper investigation into his past, as possibly Marcel from the 1912 robbery, and Madeleine secured in custody. Maigret felt the tension of unfinished business coiling tighter, the hunt for irrefutable proof against Leclerc consumed him now, as he prepared to peel back the final layers of truth. Determined to ensure justice was served despite the shadows still lurking over Montmartre, Maigret retreated to his cluttered office, spreading out the case's fragments across his desk. Madeleine's letters as M. The ledger with crescent client entries, the photograph of the violin fragment before its theft, and now Leclerc's damning note. His heavy-lidded eyes scanned each piece with methodical precision, piecing together the hidden clues he'd nearly missed in the rush. To close with Madeleine's breakdown, the first overlooked detail was in the ledger itself, not just the unpaid repairs for the Crescent client, initially tying to Madeleine, but a faint marginal note on an earlier page, scrawled in Dubois' shaky hand. V demands silence, or else. It was too vague to notice at first, buried among mundane transactions, but now screamed of Leclerc Victor pressuring Dubois long before the murder, likely over the same old debt or grudge from La Lune Croissante. Maigret's genius lay in seeing this late. It was a whisper of blackmail, a motive for Leclerc to orchestrate death. When threats failed, another missed clue surfaced in his memory of the gathering at the antique shop when he'd shown the crescent-marked fragment to the suspects. Leclerc's smirk had faltered for a split second, his fingers drumming on a shelf, a subtle tick Maigret had noted but dismissed as mere irritation. Now, it read as recognition, a suppressed jolt at seeing a symbol tied to his past machinations, proof he knew its weight beyond casual acquaintance. Lastly, the theft of the fragment itself, executed with insider precision during a guard's brief lapse, pointed to Leclerc's underworld reach. Madeleine lacked the network for such a clean act, whereas Leclerc's history of manipulating debts and favors fit perfectly. Maigret grunted softly to himself, relighting his pipe, realizing he'd been one step ahead in instinct, but a half step behind in connecting these dots, until the letter forced clarity. With these revelations anchoring his resolve, Maigret mobilized Lucas and a trusted team to dig into Leclerc's past under the tightest secrecy. Wary of corrupt influences within the gendarmerie, by midday, testimony from a former associate, coerced under pressure of unrelated charges, confirmed Leclerc's identity as Marcel, the accomplice who'd served time for the 1912 robbery while Dubois walked free. The associate recalled Leclerc's bitter rants over the years, vowing to ruin Dubois for escaping justice, and hinted at recent payments to minor thugs likely tied to the fragment's theft, or Pierre's attack, simultaneously a recheck of Leclerc's alibi witnesses unearthed inconsistencies. One bar patron admitted to lying under financial duress from Leclerc, placing him near Rue des Martyrs on the murder night, not across town. The net tightened, each thread weaving a cage of circumstantial but damning proof. Maigret faced Leclerc again in the stark interrogation room as evening fell. the loan shark's polished veneer fraying under prolonged detention. Though his sharp eyes still gleamed with defiance, armed with the new evidence, Maigret laid it out methodically, his voice a low rumble of certainty. "You're Marcel, the clerk, buried under a new name, but never forgetting 1912. You took the fall while Du Bois rebuilt, and that festered. You found Madeleine, fed her grief, turned her into your blade with promises of closure, didn't you? Cleared the path. That's your handwriting, your bribes to steal evidence. Your orders keeping your hands clean. Witnesses crack now, placing you near the shop. It's over. Confess, or the court buries you deeper than time served." He slid the letter and the ledger's marginal note across the table, alongside a signed statement from the alibi witness. Watching Leclerc's reaction as the trap snapped shut for a taut moment, Leclerc's face froze, the predator's mask slipping as his jaw tightened, a bead of sweat tracing his temple. Then, with a bitter laugh, he leaned back, voice cold, clever, "Inspector. Yes, I was Marcel, and I hated Du Bois for leaving me to rot. Madeleine was easy, her pain made her pliable. I pointed her at him, ensured she'd act, even greased. Palms to clean up after. But you've no direct proof I struck a blow. Charge me, and I'll walk my kind always does. The confession of intent, though not of physical crime, was enough for Maigret, combined with the circumstantial web alibi cracks, payments. The letter had pinned Leclerc as the orchestrator, an accessory to murder if not the hand itself. Maigret signaled Lucas to formalize the charges, knowing the courts could bind him as instigator. Even if his taunt of escape lingered, justice was served, though not without a bitter edge. As Leclerc was led away, his smirk returning faintly as if betting on legal loopholes, Maigret stood by the precinct window, the night shrouding Montmartre beyond. Madeleine, the broken soul, would face her reckoning for Du Bois' death and Pierre's attack, her grief no shield from consequence. Leclerc, the cold puppet master, was caged for now, his role as Marcel and his manipulation proven by the clues Maigret had unearthed. Ledger notes, behavioral tics, corrupted alibis demonstrating why he stayed a step ahead, even when nearly blindsided by the final twist. Yet, the loan shark's parting words gnawed at him. Men like Leclerc often slithered free, leaving an unsettling sense of unfinished business. Maigret relit his pipe, the smoke curling like the case's lingering doubts, as he explained to Lucas the missed clues that had nearly derailed them. The ledger's margin, Lucas V'd for Victor, a threat overlooked, his twitch at the crescent mark, a signal of guilt I didn't weigh enough. The theft's precision screened a wider net than Madeleine's reach. We got them, but only by catching the whispers late. Lucas nodded, awed by the depth of Maigret's hindsight. While the inspector's gaze returned to the dark city, Pierre's slow recovery offered some solace, and the streets of Rue des Martyrs might sleep quieter tonight. But Maigret knew Leclerc's kind justice held, yet the shadow of escape loomed, a reminder that some battles never fully end. He turned back to the paperwork, the weight of Montmartre's ghosts heavy on his shoulders, resolved to ensure this chapter, at least, closed with the truth fully revealed. The night draped Montmartre in a heavy shroud as Maigret stood by the window of the Quai des Orfèvres, the faint glow of his pipe casting fleeting shadows across the dim office. Justice had been served, though its edges remained jagged. Madeleine Fournier, broken by grief over a life shattered at La Lune Crescente, faced her reckoning for Etienne Dubois' murder and the attack on young Pierre, her obsession with silencing a haunting violin, now a tragic footnote in the court's records. Victor Leclerc, unmasked as Marcel, the accomplice from the 1912 robbery, was detained as the orchestrator, his cold manipulation of Madeleine's pain proven by the damning letter, cracked alibis, and overlooked clues like the ledger's marginal threat and his subtle tics of guilt. Maigret's genius had prevailed, tying together the locked room, the crescent mark, and the tangled past, ensuring the truth emerged despite nearly missing the mastermind's shadow. Yet, as he turned from the window, the paperwork finalized, and Lucas dispatched for the night. A lingering unease settled in his chest. Leclerc's parting smirk and taunt of escape hinted at a battle not fully won, and the ghosts of Rue des Martyrs whispered of questions still unanswered. Maigret descended the precinct's worn staircase, his broad frame moving with a weary deliberateness, the clack of his boots echoing in the quiet. Outside, the air was damp and cool, the mist clinging to the cobblestones as he made his way toward home. The distant hum of Montmartre's nightlife a muted backdrop to his thoughts. The case weighed on him, resolved yet incomplete in some intangible way. Pierre's slow recovery at the hospital offered a small measure of relief, and the streets near the antique shop might rest quieter with both Madeleine and Leclerc behind bars. But as he walked, his mind sifted through the details one last time, a habit born of years chasing shadows, and a minor discrepancy easily overlooked in the rush of revelations trickled at his instinct, refusing to be dismissed. It was the matter of the violin fragment's fate. Madeleine had confessed to burning it, a desperate act to erase the crescent symbol of her pain, and Maigret had accepted her word, corroborated by her emotional collapse and the lack of the piece in evidence. Yet, no trace of ash or residue had been sought or found, neither in her tenement nor near the shop, an oversight born of the case's accelerating momentum after Leclerc's letter surfaced. Her claim rang true emotionally, but practically it nagged burning wood. Even a small shard left traces, and her frail, panicked state might not have allowed for a thorough disposal. Maigret's brow furrowed as he trudged along, pipe cold between his teeth. Had she lied under pressure, hiding it elsewhere, or passed it to an unseen ally? Or had Leclerc, with his network, ensured its true vanishing as a final safeguard? A detail she parroted without knowing. The lingering question deepened as he recalled a fleeting moment from the initial crime scene, a detail buried under the weight of bigger revelations. Among the clutter of Dubois' workbench, tucked behind a pile of old receipts, there had been a small, faded envelope, unsealed and empty, bearing a faint pencil mark, a rough crescent shape, almost doodled as if in idle thought. He dismissed it as irrelevant, a quirk of Dubois' hand amidst shop chaos. But now, with the case's dust settling, it echoed differently. Was it a remnant of communication, A signal tied to the crescent client beyond Madeleine or Leclerc, or a forgotten relic of another debt, another shadow from La Lune Croissante, hinting at a wider web Maigret hadn't yet untangled. His instinct, honed by decades, whispered that this tiny mark, paired with the fragment's unverifiable fate, might point to someone or something still lurking beyond the case's boundaries. As he neared his apartment on Boulevard Richard Lenoir, the city's quiet wrapped around him, broken only by the occasional clatter of a late-night cart. Maigret paused at his building's threshold, gazing back toward Montmartre's invisible silhouette. The weight of that unanswered detail settling alongside the broader unease of Leclerc's final taunt. "My kind always walks the lone," Shark had sneered. And though the evidence held him for now accessory to murder through manipulation, bribery, and witness tampering, Maigret knew men like Leclerc often slipped through legal nets, their underworld tendrils reaching beyond immediate grasp. The possibility of a third player tied to that empty envelope or the fragment's true whereabouts gnawed at him, a cryptic hint of another mystery on the horizon. Perhaps a favor called in by Leclerc to bury loose ends deeper than even Maigret could dig. In this moment, he entered his apartment, the familiar creak of the door and Madame Maigret's soft breathing from the bedroom grounding him. Amidst the swirling doubts, shedding his overcoat, he settled into his armchair by the window, not lighting the lamp, letting the dark match his mood. The case of Du Bois' murder was closed. Justice served in the eyes of the law. Madeleine's grief-driven violence accounted for. Leclerc's puppeteering pinned by the letter and cracked alibis. The hidden clues Maigret had unearthed laid the ledger's marginal threat. Leclerc's stick at the crescent mark. The precision of the fragment's theft proved his step-ahead insight, satisfying the immediate narrative for the courts and the public. Yet, as he stared into the night, pipe unlit in his hand, the satisfaction felt hollow against that lingering question of the fragment and the crescent-doodled envelope, a subtle discord in an otherwise resolved melody. Montmartre's ghosts, he mused, never truly slept. The streets of Rue des Martyrs held their secrets close, and though this chapter ended with culprits caged, the faint echo of something undone, of a violin shard possibly hidden, of an envelope's unspoken message left a door ajar for curiosity to creep through. Had Leclerc whispered to another shadow before his arrest, ensuring a final piece stayed buried? Or was it merely Maigret's exhaustion, weaving phantoms from unimportant details? He couldn't tell. Not tonight, but the ambiguity hooked him. A quiet pull toward the next puzzle, the next shadow waiting beyond the mist. Rising slowly, Maigret moved to the small desk in the corner, jotting a note to himself for the morning. Check fragment disposal. Re-examine shop for envelope context. It was a minor thread, unlikely to unravel now, but he'd learned never to dismiss the small whispers of doubt. He returned to the window, gazing at the sleeping city, content for now with the justice wrested from tragedy, yet curious, always curious, for what lingered unsaid. The audience of his own mind stayed engaged, wondering if Montmartre's next tale already brewed in the quiet, waiting for Maigret's heavy boots to tread its path once more. For tonight, though, he let the darkness hold its secrets. Knowing a mystery never truly ends, not for a man who lived in its endless shades.